All right, welcome to Math 119-312, the mathematics of pandemics. And today we're going to be hearing about long-term effects in education. So take it away.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Hope last night it wasn't too bad. We're doing the presentation looking at long-term effects and consequences and possibilities of the pandemic in terms of education, focusing on earlier education. Overview, just quickly, what are the current experiences of students at home, of younger students, the accessibility of these students, what we can expect in the future, what could happen, and also looking at the teacher's experience. We have been focusing a lot on students, rightfully so, but taking a look at the teacher experience and possibilities, and definitely open up for discussion and questions. There we go.
All right, so just to start quickly with a few overframing questions. So for example, in general, what have we seen as the most fundamental changes in school life for these younger children? What role does an increased online presence play in these changes? For example, how have people been using social media differently? And what are some of the trends that we're seeing and may continue to see into the future are some of the questions that we'll be discussing in this section. Perfect. So just really quickly, let's take a look at the current situation by state. These are only state-mandated school opening orders. So as you can see at the bottom, so all the yellows are no order, all the greens are ordered open, the oranges are partial closures, and the reds are full closures. So as you can see, only a few states has given any mandated opening or closure orders. So for example, we could see Iowa, there's Arizona, there's Texas, there's Florida, and we can kind of infer what has been happening in Texas and Florida. That much has been known. But the rest of the states have kind of left it up to local districts to decide, with obviously a lot of restrictions in place for the schools if they do decide to reopen. All right, so really quickly, let's take a look at what school is looking now for most children. So I'm just going to describe some of the CDC guidelines. So essentially, since children are more likely to have asymptomatic infections, and the biggest risks there is exposure to school staff, administrators, and teachers, all students attending in-person instruction are to wear masks until everyone is vaccinated, obviously. Now, the vaccines are now in their final stages of testing. And as we have discussed for the past few months, the vaccines will normally take years, if not decades, to develop and begin to be administered. But COVID vaccines are way different. Now, the issue here is that younger students are not always considered to be the most at risk. So they are not going to be priorities when the vaccines do finish getting developed. So it will most likely take way longer for younger students to get vaccinated, which means a prolonged period for virtual and/or hybrid modes of instruction and the need for that. All right, and let's dive a bit deeper into social development, use of masks, and perhaps Zoom fatigue and the way that they have been impacting young students' lives. So as we know, research on children and teens' physiological and psychological development has always shown that the teenagers are a vital window for learning for verbal and nonverbal communication methods and cues. Now, for effective verbal communication, we know that masks, which cover the mouth and with a cloth, it has two detrimental consequences. One, which is impaired auditory signals. So sometimes we know it's a little harder to hear what's going on around us if we have masks on. Because we're not getting these auditory signals from the lips, which the signal is used by human beings to aid in speech understanding anyway, but it mostly is very difficult for deaf and hard of hearing students who may use lip reading and may completely rely on visual cues for understanding speech. Now, some professors, as for example, our very own Professor Miller, has adopted clear face coverings, so clear masks, which are not just like face coverings, obviously, it has to wrap completely around the face. But these may not be available to all schools or educators. especially in lower income communities, in which case they must resort to written communication, which is definitely not ideal for earlier education. Clear masks are actually also recommended for teachers of just young students or students who learn English or other languages, perhaps, and students with other disabilities. They're very helpful, however, unfortunately, it is not available to all people. And let's talk really quickly about Zoom fatigue. As we know, it is very much real. As college students, we know firsthand just how difficult it is to stare into the void of our computer screen for hours on end. But this effect is very apparent for younger students, as it lowers concentration, it reduces the learnability of academic material, and it just causes general irritability, I think much more than it does in college students. And overall, it's pretty indisputable that the time fearing COVID have been and will continue to be very difficult for younger students. Okay. So here you can see a quick graph of just the use of social media in the first 2 months of pandemics. Now, this is just data collected by 2 online providers, so it is not strictly for younger students, but as you can see, we see like a very big spike in the use of websites like Facebook or Netflix or YouTube, and also slightly for their app versions as well. So this drastic increase in social media usage has obviously been apparent across the board. And these graphs obviously only show trends from February to March, but it's hard to dispute the fact that social media has grown exponentially and will continue to skyrocket. So let's discuss what some of these effects have been for younger students. So as we know, younger students have not only been relying much more on digital devices for their education, but only for social media. Now, the younger students' increase in social media use actually mirrors the adult usage. So in this Harris poll conducted between late March and early May, they found that between 46% and 51% of US adults were using social media more since the outbreak began. In the more recent surveys, 51% of total respondents, 60% of blah, 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 blah. Essentially, adults have been using social media way more as well. However, in this new study by Michelle Droing et al., we could kind of see that greater child anxiety was associated with greater parent anxiety, and the greater parent anxiety, the more the parents are going to use social media. And the survey results, if you take a look at the chart on the right, the survey results, that's the survey results for children. After controlling for parent anxiety and family characteristics. The findings essentially were that children with greater anxiety, as well as older children, were more likely to have increased their technology usage to connect more frequently. In another report, Parenting Teens in the Age of Social Media from Anna Robert H. Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago, and that one surveyed nearly 3,000 parents, it stated that 63% of teens are using social media more than they did pre-pandemic. And for the parents who would normally set and enforce rules of social media usage, 80% said that they've temporarily relaxed the rules due to family tension, social pressures, et cetera, et cetera. And very interestingly, nearly half, so around 46% of respondents reported that they are more appreciative of social media's role in their teens' quarantine life. However, social media has shown its possible detrimental impacts on teen mental health in so many ways. So it is a little unclear how these behaviors will persist beyond social distancing protocols, but we know that this will remain the truth for at least the next year, since the vaccine is not going to be, a thing until at least next year. And we know that the increased use of social media can greatly alter child psychology. It can lower self-esteem, give rise to intensified feelings of depression, anxiety, and loneliness, et cetera, et cetera. And these factors can not only negatively impact a child's mental health, it also impacts a child's education in far-reaching ways. All right, finally, let's take a look at some extrapolated information from prior crises. Now, these 2 articles are really interesting. They essentially take 2 crisis responses from 2 prior crisis, so Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Katrina. So let's take a look at Hurricane Harvey. So similar to the situation that we have been seeing during COVID, after the occurrence of the hurricane, there were mass withdrawals of students residing in impact zones, and that was essentially the critical concern. And there had to be considerations of issues such as long-term recovery of personal residences, personal belongings, like how are people going to live without electricity and internet for a few weeks. Yeah, and the big concern here in the article was actually that online students were not getting the support that they needed, and digital accessibility was a huge problem. So especially for online students, but also for all students, who were affected by Harvey had issues with technology that is required to be successful in an online class. So they did not have reliable internet connections or computers to work on. However, I think for these students, it is more the issue was more than that they lacked computers and Wi-Fi. It was more so that it was very difficult for them to adapt to new circumstances given the lack of resources. Now, let's take a look at the comparison to Hurricane Katrina, in which the author actually draws much more explicit connections between the hurricane and our pandemic today. So the author suggested a few possibilities moving into the future at the end. The big change that occurred after the Hurricane Katrina was that rather than the traditional school zone system, they opted for school choice system since people were moving around so much more frequently now, and it was just not feasible for people to have to go to school according to the zone since sometimes they have to move schools almost on a monthly basis. So essentially, the school system, the government sort of adapted to current circumstances and changed things accordingly. And the author suggested some possibilities for COVID as a supplement that essentially online school could become a much more prominent supplement, which I think we already see happening. There may also be a shift to homeschooling or charter schools and private schools. Now, these are three kind of big possibilities that we may discuss in the future. But yeah, and he also hypothesized a rethinking of the roles of student and teacher since that dynamic has been heavily impacted. The bottom line here is that all the lessons that the authors proposed in light of past crises have been in some way in relation to accessibility or the inaccessibility of education, which leads us into our next section that focuses on digital accessibility and inequality. And I will now pass on to Ruth.
Okay, so when thinking of the student experience, it's incredibly important to take into account the overarching challenges that each child faces that may affect their learning and how they overcome unique struggles. Low-income individuals specifically are more likely to contract COVID at work and in other places and can be unable to afford to test or receive treatment. Naturally, this will stress out their families and thus the children who go to school. And so this increased stress, as well as household responsibilities and other unforeseen consequences, can make education much more challenging for these people. The pandemic has aggravated many of the problems minority students have already faced. So in this section, I'll be briefly going over ways in which income and class change a student's ability to benefit from education, and furthermore, what opportunities disenfranchised students are missing out on. So first, we're going to think about how we define class. I'll go over some metrics and income to make sure we're all sort of on the same page. As many of us have heard already, the top 1% of American citizens hold a disproportionate percentage of the country's wealth, which has steadily been increasing even during the pandemic. In 2020, this percentage of people had a net worth that was around 30% of the country's total, and on average, the individual income is around $400,000. For low income, the mean range of income is between 18 and 28,000. For middle income, it's 75 to 80,000, and high income is 173 to 200,000. So not only is our country obviously rattled by some sort of wealth gap, but it disproportionately challenges people of color and women. If we consider white as this historical standard worker with labor rights and benefits that we're all working towards, then there are obvious disadvantages to being non-white and a woman. So the pay gap, as this is proven, we can see these different graphics, is very real. Finally, so income and cost of living vary state by state, so we really have to look at it in context of location. And so a more accurate representation then is the value of the dollar in one particular state or region. So a Stanford report defined the term digital divide as a reference to the gap between access to computers and internet that underprivileged people have versus the same access that privileged people have. On the right, we can see that most people own phones, but as we take into account things like, do they own a laptop or a computer, as well as internet, and what quality is the computer, we can see that shrink significantly for a lot of low income and middle income individuals. So all of this being said, this shows up very explicitly in the school experience, where a lot of these factors come into play when we think about how often students are going to school. So students with disabilities, if they're low income and non-white students, are likely to chronically miss more school than their counterparts. And of course, missing school is correlated with lower graduation rates and performance gaps, which we know will later affect earnings and employment rates. Now, specifically during remote schooling, teachers have found it really hard to encourage students to come to class and submit assignments and participate in other ways. And as many of us online students know, it can be really easy to not join that Zoom call if you have bad internet or a loud home life or dorm life. And it can be really hard to focus. And not only is it hard to join classes, but it's hard to turn in things. For students who already had these sort of problems, even when they were going in person, this is making it so much worse. And because of this sort of like chain that we've laid out, their job prospects later in life will be much worse than if they were able to go to school consistently and participate in the way that they're intended to. Okay, so I'm first going to visit an example, and this is taken from the public school system of New Haven, Connecticut, not too far from here. School-age kids, according to this sample schedule that they provided online, are attending school for about 5 days for synchronous learning online, or 5 hours for 4 days a week. So they're given one off day, but otherwise they're expected to be on Zoom for 5 hours straight, essentially, with a break like lunch for half an hour in between. As someone who only has like 2 hours of class a day, I really can't imagine the strain and the stress this puts student under. And that's with me living in a dorm where it's a pretty controlled environment. I have a laptop, obviously, and we have, you know, the campus Wi-Fi, as bad as it may be sometimes. And I feel like this also contributes again to the Zoom exhaustion and just plain boredom. You're staring at a screen for 5 hours, and that definitely takes something out of you. So this means not only students will, they'll not only be forced to use their phones if they don't have a laptop or access, but if they don't have internet additionally, then they'll have to go find some cafe or other public space to not only join class, but do assignments and their work, which increases the challenges of focusing. And I can't imagine being able to join class in that way. And so that makes a school day in general and attendance just really challenging and nearly impossible for a lot of kids. So another example actually in which Philadelphia tried to address this digital divide, the district voted to approve a $11 million fund to provide 50,000 laptops to their students. There's about 203,000 students within this district. You can see the district on the right, actually. This income map shows the average income by area, and we can see that the Philly region is much lighter than the surrounding suburbs, indicating a lower income. The mean income actually within the Philly area is 46,000. And if we remember back to the earnings related to class, this plants most of Philadelphia within low and middle class. So it's great that the city was able to do this. I hope that more cities sort of are able to pull together funds like this. But it wasn't just that they were able to provide this through the educational system, but actually a corporation donated $5 million. So let's talk about why there might be some problems with this sort of donation and setup. I'll provide a couple short answers because there's so much more to go into. So before this donation, that means that approximately 1/4 of the students in Philly didn't have computers. So it took a pandemic actually to provide equal access through laptops. And if this is true in Philly, I assume it's true in many other similar cities, maybe even worse. And we can imagine, again, that it disproportionately affects those minorities. Also, this donation of computers and money doesn't really take into account internet access. And because of the reasons I previously outlined, there are still major obstacles in the way for students to access Zoom classes. So finally, the district's inability to support itself without this corporate funding and donation just sort of outlines like the education systems as a whole inability to support itself. In theory, in a perfect world, the education system would have been able to just sort of provide this money without asking for corporate input. But because Philadelphia was lucky enough to get almost half of that donation from a company, they were able to provide those computers. But what happens for the cities and the smaller districts that aren't able to get donations like that? And it raises even a larger question of how does education become privatized when corporates start donating? And what will this mean for teachers if they remain in this sector that is slowly becoming private?
Cool, thank you. Okay, now switching the attention to teachers, right? We have been focusing a lot on students, you know, all the headlines worried about education, but it's usually on the students. So now looking at teachers, you know, what are the things we see immediately, the immediate consequences, immediate problems, maybe things that are becoming exposed. How are teachers reacting? How are they feeling, you know, emotionally in terms of mental health? And well, I mean, now, and, you know, focusing on the possibilities for and of change, you know, good change, bad change, ambiguous, sort of in the middle, and the bigger implications on the teacher economy and education, of course. Okay, now, looking at the pressing issues and the immediate consequences, right? There's been a shortage of teachers countrywide, and that begs the question: okay, who is picking up the slack? The Economic Policy Institute reports as of September, public K-12 education employment is more than 500,000 jobs before its year-ago levels. Half of these are teachers, and you know, and we're not only talking. Maybe to put it more into perspective, it's 900,000 jobs in education below where it should have been to keep up with growth in student enrollment since 2008. So, you know, we're talking almost 1 million here. Partially open schools and closed schools alike, you know, how are teachers? There's a lot of anecdotal evidence of stress burnout levels from teachers, especially those that have had to sort of had this hybrid system of things, right? It started in the, you know, colleges, this hybrid way of teaching, you know, remote and in person, but that sort of burden was laid on elementary and middle school teachers. Completely different response, you know. The American Federation of Teachers shows 30% of teachers say pandemic has made them more likely to retire earlier than planned. And, you know, thinking about teachers, most teachers are in the age of mid-40s. You know, they're populations that are very susceptible to the virus, right? So thinking about how they're reacting and the possible gaps that will be left in the future. Shaking the foundations of the teacher economy, right? Economy Policy Institute, teachers earn 19% less than similarly skilled professionals. And again, right here, full-time public school teachers are earning less on average, inflation adjusted, than they did in 1990. Not only that, I mean, the August report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that 7.6 million employed in local government education, which is most public school employees. It's the fewest number that we've had since 20 years, right? So what am I saying here? This is a workforce, a teacher economy that has not been treated fairly for a very long time. And there's a reckoning that's been happening with the crisis. And keeping in mind as well, very interesting, and I didn't think about this, you know, the vast majority of public school teachers are female, and they have been for a very long time. And so you have some of these teachers leaving, you know, being compelled to leave for mental health reasons, or for family reasons, or just for looking for other things, right? For this lack of care for them. And it's this sort of idea that we're not really worrying about teachers as much as we should be. You know, we have this idea ingrained culturally, you know, that women should settle for less. So that's something to think about, very, in my opinion, very important. Changes in pedagogy and teacher skills, right? Thinking in long term, right? Again, reports of teachers leaving are varied, but over 30% of them plan to retire earlier. What can we expect from that, right? We see a lot of dedicated teachers have stuck around and they've adapted, but we will have a new generation of teachers, you know, thinking about it, during the pandemic, who's doing what. We're going to have a lot of people eager to jump back into the economy once it's back in full gear. And I put this population pyramid to sort of think about, you know, who these new teachers will be and who these new students will be. Right, so right here in the middle, in the first sort of peak, I guess, you have people of 29, from mid-20s to 30s, right? So these will potentially be the new teachers. You know, we're going to have a new set of skills that they're going to bring to the table. For decades, according to the National Assessment of Education Progress, which is a project administered by the National Center of Education Statistics, we've seen a decrease in school performance in 4th and 8th graders, you know. So we know change is needed, you know, but will it be met, you know, and with this idea that teachers are not being at the replacement levels, with keeping in touch with student enrollment, you know, the teacher to student ratio, thinking about that. And as well as thinking about this new generation of teachers, right? I think everybody has seen, well, I mean, I don't want to assume, but a bigger presence of teachers and educators in social media platforms, especially I would say in TikTok, you know, using the sort of these tools for cultural bridges towards students. We have seen as well teachers more in touch, maybe paradoxically, more in touch with students, family situation, you know, just a closer relationship overall. So thinking about what these gaps will do in the future. Now, very interesting here. We're looking at data from Data USA. It's a visualization engine of public US government data. Right here, what you're seeing here is 2018 data on the critical and distinctive skills necessary for elementary and middle school teachers, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, on the left, right, the one that says value, you have a sort of, it's called LV value. I was not able to find the meaning of the abbreviation, but what it is a unit of relevance of these skills. So, what do we see? These skills, which have proven to be the most necessary ones today for the crisis for teachers, are the ones that they're most lacking of. You know, it sort of makes you think this will necessarily have to shift. The standards will have to shift of what is expected of teachers. Now, on the right, we see a similar but honestly pretty different picture. You know, and what is it? What am I showing? This is the there we go. The revealed comparative advantage, right? And I tell people, you know, look in the middle of this equation, right? The RCA is actually an index used in international economics for calculating the relative advantage or disadvantage of a country in the exportation of a certain good, looking at trade flows. So we look at the first term over here, you know, E sub CP, it's the country's exports of some product, right, from a set of commodities, over, right, this summation, right, it's the country's total exports of products, P, of the whole set of commodities, right? So, you know, looking, what is it? What's the numerator? It's the proportion of the country's exports of the product, of the class of products in consideration. And now on the bottom, you see, it looks different, but it's basically the same thing, but in terms of the whole world. It's a proportion of the world's exports in that class, right? And so what was very interesting is that we were able to, you know, this sort of extrapolation of a completely different seemingly arbitrary economic calculation metric for this kind of stuff, for the distribution of skills, right? So in the RCA in this case is taking into account the share of number of citizens in some location that work in some occupation, in this case middle and elementary and middle school teachers, and taking into account the total share of these employees in that occupation. You know, if normal LV levels were used, you would have more populated locations dominating. And if you had percentages, you would have smaller locations with smaller number of employees dominating the statistic, right? So we see right here, there's a lot of, some skills are needed more than average than others, right? And I want to point out here, you know, in this side on the left, you see, it seems like it's a lot of skill in that area, whereas when you put it into perspective, into a relativistic point of view, statistically, it shows quite a different image. Right. So now looking at the classroom and the school day, what does that mean? The tangible aspect distribution of the classroom and the school day, the intangible sort of organization of school. The teacher demands of the students, of the student, determine the teacher. You know, that's a question. I'm posing that as a question because it's interesting. You know, students, neurologically speaking, younger students adapt more easily to the situation, whereas teachers have a much harder time, of course. And so it's sort of this interplay between who's determining whose condition, right? With the rise of virus cases across the country and hospitalizations, and the lack of a solid plan, virtual teaching is being instituted indefinitely in a lot of places. And, you know, sort of thinking, so this is going to stay at least for a while more. Again, as I mentioned, teachers being led into the personal life of students, and that completely changes the dynamics in the classroom when we go if and when students go back. This sort of maybe a bigger focus on individualized learning, you know, expressing opinion, you know, sort of use a more personal touch in the classroom, let's call it. School districts could evolve from being the provider of everything to making sure that everything is provided. This sort of reorganization, this restructuring of who does what, right? I think what we have seen is, you know, this sort of lack of response from the federal government trickles down to the states, which trickles down to the school districts. And now in Williams, we saw a very effective response because it's a college. It's a very different situation. You know, when thinking in public school districts, very, very different dynamics go on. And I think webcam versus in-class dynamics, I think we can just perfectly call Miller for this. You know, it's this complete switch, right? You have some students in screens, you have some students in person. It's a sort of change in dynamics, which will call for a different set of skills in the teachers. You know, thinking back to the last slide, will we see, you know, a lot of parents have been, from many surveys have been thinking, you know, does my kid really need 6-7 hours of school? You know, we're starting to realize that less hours are necessary. So when we go back into the normality of school life, of a early school life, will we see less hours for teachers? You know, will we see higher wages therefore? Will we see more freedom in the curriculum, you know, taking into account more the personal life of the student? And again, the physical organization of the classroom. Now, let's take a brief look at what I have here. You know, the input and the output. What is this? What is that? The input is the intermediate input. It's the amount of money spent by a specific industry in another industry. In this case, what I'm looking at is the amount of money, right, put into the educational services, healthcare, and social assistance industry, which includes the middle school and elementary middle school teachers. And the output is the gross output. It's a sort of a recent metric which measures an industry's economic activity in the production of goods and services. It is a broader version of GDP. And because of that, it should be taken with a grain of salt. You know, perhaps a better name for gross output would be gross domestic market activity, because it's not so much about the output available for consumption as it is about this sort of movement of of wealth, right? From one industry to another. What do I put it here, right? It will be very interesting to see these shifts in both ways. I would predict we will see more manufacturing and even real estate input into the industries of elementary and middle school teachers, taking into consideration the digital divide, more infrastructure, different classroom settings. So we will see that, as well as the output, right? And this is where the privatization of education will come into play, sort of seeing where is most of this value being produced by elementary and middle school teachers go to. Now, privatization of education, arguably the biggest thing we're going to talk about, right? We have an education system where teachers are underpaid, overworked, and don't have the flexibility that has become so important for workers now. What do I mean by that? This sort of more liberal workforce, right? More dynamic workforce, right? All these things have caused teachers to seek opportunities outside of the traditional schooling system. And e-learning companies have started to reach out to these sort of displaced teachers that fled their work, and offering better wages, offering more freedom. And, offering the same thing, basically, which is to teach students. We take age and race demographics into account as well. I mean, this mobility, this ability to move from job to job, who do we expect to be most in the place for that kind of stuff? Perhaps we would expect younger teachers. Perhaps we would not expect minorities to have this sort of ability to just switch from job to job. So that is also very important to keep in mind. Privatizers often list reducing costs and bureaucracy and putting individual needs over the public good as goals. Of course, this corporate world, right? The private sector puts efficiency as its goal, but it also puts profit as its goal, right? Privatization, I was looking at this presentation by the National Center for the Study of Privatization in Education. It was a presentation they gave for the National Conference of State Legislatures. Privatization has been a trend, growing trend since the 1990s. There's been a steady growth of privatization in education in many, many forms, just talking about homeschool vouchers, about more recently about all these ed tech companies, e-learning companies, and now what do we have? We have these tech startups, again, what I just mentioned, these e-learning companies taking advantage, jumping in. Analytically, we can talk about, freedom of choice, efficiency, equity, and social cohesiveness. But more practically, we think about finance, regulation, and support services, right? Will this really benefit the student? Because it will probably benefit the teacher, but will it benefit the student, right? 2020 PDK poll surveyed parents. For the 19th straight year in PDK polls, lack of financial support tops the list of the biggest problems facing the public schools. This survey was done by randomly selecting participants via address-based sampling to participate in survey research projects, and they even PDK gave the opportunity for households without internet access to participate by providing web-enabled device and free internet service. So anyway, what is this? On the one side, you have failed attempts, although present attempts, of privatization of education. And the other side, you have a system that is clearly not working, neither for the student nor for the teacher. So this survey was conducted in early March. It's interesting to think about we know the acceleration of trends. Which way is it going, right? We have seen a lot of changes in the past recent years. And, I encourage people to think about things that maybe don't seem so obvious. Khan Academy, how many times have we relied on a video by Sal from Khan Academy to sort of review a lesson, right? So it's this sort of subliminal presence of the steps towards privatization of education. And just one more thing to think about, this could exacerbate the problem it's supposed to address. We think about the digital divide. Which of the students will be the ones that benefit from this privatized corporate sector education, So that's something to keep in mind a lot. Optimism versus pessimism, right? Many things are temporary, but as I said, schools are adopting indefinitely this sort of model, if not hybrid, then just remotely. So might be a good idea to start thinking about this in the long term, right? We could have greater investment in teachers, teachers attaining a better spot, right, in the economy, a reformed public education system, addressing these things that are very obvious now. Reform pedagogy, more freedom for the teacher, right, and not just just regurgitate facts. We could address digital divide. We could give teachers a bigger place. There's a lot of place for improvement, is what I'm trying to say. But on the other side, we might have a continuation. We might have these gaps in the teacher economy, right? And right here in the bullet below, we have, if there's no reform made, it'll mean less teachers, less incentives to go into this economy of the teacher economy, and it's the question of, will this drive maybe technology to replace teachers or an improvement in the teacher situation? And it's just one more thing to keep in mind. We cannot compare the experiences of professors to those of elementary and middle school teachers. As students, we have we have it easier in a way, as Ruth was telling us about the Zoom fatigue, or the amount of time able, we're more flexible. We have better abilities to change our schedules. It's not the same for teachers. It's not the same for students, younger students. So thinking about, should we look towards, should we look forwards, or should we look back and sort of think about what we're doing? And just two more things, my bad. I'm going to send these out to Professor Miller. Very interesting, a survey by the Heart Research Associate nationwide of teachers and parents. Very interesting. And one more thing, datausaio.com. It's this ongoing partnership between the MIT and Deloitte. Just a data gathering engine, right? But it's so useful for visualization of data. It's a rather young enterprise. So I really do encourage people to use that website. I found it very intuitive and very user-friendly, very accessible. Now, let's talk about some solutions. Here's some pictures. Very nice.
Right. So in terms of the solutions that we're thinking about, by no means are we professionals, but in doing our own research, these are just essentially some themes that we saw as causing problems essentially within the institution. So the largest theme was sort of the ineffectiveness of the education system to provide students and employees, teachers, with the services that they need to excel. And so the first point was very general. We should increase spending on education, which is a very popular idea. And we haven't really made big gains in that arena. And not only that, but reworking the school system so that we can use that money most effectively and efficiently. On top of that, we need to directly confront institutional inequality among students and faculty, and work to address those problems through proactive means, like providing equal opportunities and resources, monitoring at-risk districts and schools, and standardization across states. And finally, on the topic of teachers, we need to give educators benefits and pay that encourages them to stay within the public school system, and rewards them for their work and their education that they've been using to back up all of these students at hand. And in that way, they might be less tempted to join private institutions, whether in person or online. But that's about it. I hope you all enjoyed our robust presentation.
We have a couple minutes for questions, discussions. I'm gonna try to open the chat. If you guys, Ruth and Wei Wei, if you guys want to take any questions. Oh, okay. I encourage people to send any questions. Or Professor Miller, do you have any questions?
Sure. So if nobody else will ask, which groups do you think are the most at risk right now? And if you had to prioritize, what would your top priority if you could only do one thing?
You mean groups at risk of the virus itself, or of these?
Of the changes in education.
the thing is, what I have noticed at least, and I mentioned it briefly, younger students have a very good ability at adapting. This is not something that teachers have. And, in the beginning, you had a lot of surveys. Most students, younger students, were very worried about the situation, and you had teachers not worry very much about, the future. This was in March, right? Now you have a complete switch. You have students seeing some benefits, of course, struggling, but seeing some benefits to this complete switch, hybrid or remote teaching. And you have a lot of teachers being very unhappy. So I think a happy teacher is a happy student. I would be more worried about the teachers. It's an age group that is susceptible to the virus. It's an age group. It's an economy that has been sort of left out culturally and fiscally and financially, right, for a very long time. So I would say there should be more focus on teachers rather than students, just neurologically speaking, in terms of being able to adapt.
Yeah, I would agree. If teachers are given the right tools to empower their students, and that way it's sort of like this sort of a trickle down, essentially, in which they can then help their students who are also struggling. But without those sort of overseeing professionals, there isn't much hope for the students.
In Massachusetts, we actually delayed the start of the school year in most places of the state 10 days to provide additional training for the teachers. And the argument was, this is something that's going to be with us for a long time. It is worth taking a little bit more time in the beginning to set up the training and to try to create a good infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, again, you side with the skills itself, right? This is the Bureau of Labor Statistics saying, okay, these are the skills a teacher should have. That does not make a teacher resilient, right? Not thinking just in terms of skill. I keep going back to this sort of how teachers are doing, how they've been doing historically speaking. So, I mean, how much we've seen the most dedicated, there's so much anecdotal evidence. We've seen the most dedicated teachers stick around for the students, make an extra effort, but not everyone can do that. There's so many different situations. Some teachers have a limit. Like I said, a lot of reports of stress burnouts. So, yeah, I mean, I do hope that there's more coverage on teachers, on the well-being of teachers, because at the end, again, I already said it, a happy teacher is a happy student.
Thank you. Any other questions? I thank you again for the presentation, and then we will continue on Wednesday. And
there seems to be a question.
Okay.
Can I just ask one question more to be provocative? I've just shared a couple of things. It's something I've been doing a lot of private research on. Just to add the thought, I mean, it's great to identify the problems, but if you assume that all states are broke at the margin, I mean, really broke. I mean, we're talking bankruptcies right now, and cities and towns are broke, and they've made peace by not funding these schools, and the problems are being accelerated by the pandemic, which is really the catalyst here. Where do you think the money's going to come from to do what you're talking about if it doesn't at least at some significant portion come from private capital?
I mean, I would say
that where the money's going to come from. I mean, frankly, because you can say we got to refund the schools, and I'm going to say who's going to pay for it. Williams has unlimited resources, so you guys are in a bubble within a bubble within a bubble. And so, but for most of the schools that don't have your resources, they're going to fail, or they very well could fail. And so just saying is that, I would keep more of an open mind about figuring out some way to work collaboratively with private capital, because, I mean, that's where education became, just a question. Let me just ask the question rather than.
Right. And Ruth, you had something to say?
Yeah, I would just say this is not the first time that the United States has been in some state of bankruptcy, and the concept of like balancing a budget just really encompasses prioritizing things, and if education should be the priority, it's not only investment, but it stands and improves the well-being of literally everyone, whether indirectly or directly. Just rerouting money from other sources. The United States is by no means shy of borrowing, so I feel like that money could, with the correct legislature and passes on monetary policy could be easily rerouted into the education system, and a little really goes a long way. In terms of the large federal budget, a couple $1 million is really nothing.
Well, that's the policy framework, and that's really what we're talking about. It's just interesting.
Awesome. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed and got something out of the presentation.